The forest was quiet, save for the sound of leaves rustling underfoot as Bill, Daniel, and Chris moved cautiously through the trees. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on them, but there was no time to rest. They knew the men chasing them were still out there, relentless in their pursuit. Chris stayed close to Bill, his golden fur catching the faint morning light filtering through the canopy. His ears twitched at every sound, alert to any sign of danger. Bill's mind raced with the revelations from the warehouse. The documents they had uncovered painted a chilling picture, a conspiracy that reached further than he could have imagined. But now, with Marie gone to deliver the evidence to the authorities, their focus shifted to survival. They needed to regroup, to figure out their next move. Yet, even as they pressed forward, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Daniel broke the silence first, his voice low but urgent. "We can't stay in one place for too long. If they find us," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The threat was clear. Chris suddenly stopped, his body tense. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and his gaze fixed on a distant part of the forest. Bill followed the dog's line of sight, his hand instinctively tightening around the leash. At first, there was nothing but the dense foliage. Then, slowly, a figure emerged, a woman with disheveled blonde hair and haunted eyes. It was Marie. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held them up in a gesture of peace. I couldn't go to the police," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're everywhere. I think they've infiltrated the station." Bill's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have come back," he said coldly. "You've already put us in enough danger." Marie flinched but stood her ground. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "But I'm trying to fix this. Please let me help you." Before Bill could respond, Chris stepped forward, positioning himself between Marie and Bill. His growl deepened, a clear warning. Bill placed a hand on the dog's head, his expression softening slightly. "Chris doesn't trust you," he said firmly. "And if he doesn't, then neither do I." Marie nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand," she murmured, "but I'll leave you with this." She pulled a small folded note from her pocket and placed it on the ground before stepping back. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Daniel watched her go, his brow furrowed. "Do we trust her?" he asked. Bill shook his head. "No, but we read the note." Inside the folded paper was a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The truth about Chris is bigger than you think." Later that day, as they continued their journey, Chris suddenly veered off the path, pulling Bill toward a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a striking white Samoyed, her fur pristine despite the rugged surroundings. She regarded them calmly, her intelligent eyes locking onto Chris. Beside her sat a uniformed police officer, his hand resting lightly on the dog's collar. "Chloe, stay," the officer commanded softly before turning his attention to Bill and his companions. "You're a hard group to track down," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "We've been looking for you." Bill tensed, his grip tightening on Chris's leash. "Who are you?" he demanded. The officer held up his badge. "Detective Harris." "And this is Chloe," he added, nodding toward the Samoyed. "She's been instrumental in helping us locate key players in this case, including you." Daniel stepped forward, his voice wary. "What do you want from us?" Harris hesitated, then spoke carefully. "There's more going on here than meets the eye. The organization chasing you, it's not just about Chris. It's about what he represents. And until we get to the bottom of it, none of you are safe." Chris seemed unfazed by the newcomer, his tail wagging slightly as he sniffed Chloe. The two dogs exchanged a brief glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. For a moment, the tension in the air eased. Bill looked at Chris, then back at Harris. "What does he represent?" he asked quietly. Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's what we're trying to figure out. But one thing is certain. Whoever controls Chris controls the key to unraveling this entire operation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Bill felt the weight of responsibility settle over him once again. Chris wasn't just a loyal companion. He was a symbol of something far greater, and protecting him meant confronting truths that might change everything they thought they knew. The clearing was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Chris stood beside Bill, his golden fur catching the faint morning light. His eyes, however, were fixed on Chloe, the striking white Samoyed who sat calmly beside Detective Harris. There was something about her calm demeanor, her piercing gaze, that seemed to captivate Chris in a way Bill had never seen before. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to Chris's admiration. She remained focused, her ears perked and her nose occasionally twitching, as if scanning the air for any sign of danger. Detective Harris kept a firm grip on her leash, his sharp eyes scanning the group. "We don't have much time," he said finally, breaking the silence. "They're still out there, and they'll be looking for you." Bill nodded, his mind racing. He glanced down at Chris, who was now sitting quietly, his tail thumping softly against the ground. The dog's eyes never left Chloe, even as the tension in the clearing grew thicker. Bill couldn't help but notice the change in Chris's behavior. It wasn't fear or aggression. It was something softer, almost reverent. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. "What do we do now?" he asked, glancing at Harris. "If what you're saying is true, then staying here isn't an option." Harris hesitated, then spoke carefully. "We need to move quickly. My team is working on tracking the organization, but until we can dismantle them, you're all in danger. Especially him." He nodded toward Chris, his expression grim. "They won't stop until they get what they want." Chris let out a soft whine, his gaze flickering briefly to Bill before returning to Chloe. Bill placed a reassuring hand on the dog's head, his brow furrowing. "And what exactly do they want with him?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's what we're trying to figure out. But one thing is clear. Whoever controls Chris controls the key to unraveling this entire operation." As they moved deeper into the forest, Chris continued to steal glances at Chloe whenever she came into view. At first, it was subtle, a quick glance here, a lingering stare there, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Even Harris noticed, raising an eyebrow as he watched Chris trot ahead to walk beside Chloe. "Looks like someone's got a crush," Harris remarked dryly, though there was a hint of amusement in his voice. Chloe, for her part, seemed unbothered by the attention. She walked with purpose, her movements graceful and deliberate. Occasionally, she would pause to sniff the air or examine a patch of disturbed earth, but otherwise, she remained focused on their surroundings. Chris, however, couldn't seem to focus on anything else. When Chloe stopped to investigate a fallen branch, Chris mirrored her actions, sniffing the same spot as if trying to understand what had caught her interest. When she tilted her head to listen to a distant sound, Chris did the same, his ears swiveling in perfect sync with hers. Bill watched the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "He's never acted like this before," he murmured to Daniel, who shrugged in response. "Maybe it's just instinct," Daniel suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Dogs are social creatures. Maybe he sees her as part of the pack." But Bill wasn't so sure. There was something more to it, something deeper. Chris wasn't just following Chloe. He was studying her, learning from her. And while Chloe didn't seem to acknowledge it, there was a quiet confidence in her presence that seemed to draw Chris in. Later that evening, as the group settled into a makeshift camp, Chris positioned himself near Chloe, lying down a few feet away. Chloe glanced at him briefly, her tail giving a single, dismissive wag before she turned her attention back to Harris. Chris didn't seem deterred. Instead, he rested his chin on his paws, his eyes fixed on her with unwavering devotion. Harris chuckled softly as he observed the scene. "Looks like your boys got it bad," he said to Bill, nodding toward Chris. "Don't worry, he's not the first." Chloe's got that effect on everyone. Bill smiled faintly, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this connection than met the eye. Chris had always been loyal, always protective, but this was different. It was as if Chloe represented something Chris had been searching for all along, something he couldn't quite put into words. As the fire crackled softly in the center of the camp, casting flickering shadows across the trees, Bill found himself wondering what the future held. They were still being hunted, still surrounded by unanswered questions. But for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone in this fight. And as Chris lay there, his eyes locked on Chloe, Bill realized that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, unexpected alliances could form. Whether it was between humans, dogs, or something in between, these connections had the power to change everything. To be continued.